Today's speakers will be Andrea Radisky and Heather Seitz, and they're going to talk to us today about the impact of COVID-19 curricular shifts on learning gains in the Microbiology for Health Sciences concept inventory. Today's talk will be about 25 to 30 minutes, and afterwards there'll be lots and lots of time for lots of interaction and some questions that I'll pose from you, our audience. So when you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, which can be found in the lower part of your Zoom toolbar. And you can also ask anonymously. So if you have an anonymous question, you have that option too. So today's webinar is being brought to you by the ASM Education Department on behalf of the Journal Microbiology and Biology Education. And if you have any tech support needs today, you're going to send a message to Justin Van Blaricom, and he will help you with all your tech support needs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers today. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Radisky, and I am delighted to be here with you today. I'm just sharing our slideshow that we have prepared. So let me get that going. So today we're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on microbiology curriculum as measured by the Microbiology for Health Sciences concept inventory. And first, I just want to say part of what makes this work so much fun is just having a fun colleague to collaborate with. I'm just so lucky to be able to work with Dr. Seitz. She's just so much fun, and working on the MHSCI with her and also on this paper has been just a ray of sunshine. So first, let me talk a little bit about concept inventories in general. The first concept inventory was developed by Carl Wyman et al. In 1992 in the Force Concept Inventory for Physics. And it kind of set the stage for the use of concept inventories to measure student learning gains in science courses. So after that concept inventory sort of took off, other concept inventories were developed in experimental biology, in design, genetics, host pathogen interactions, meiosis, the lac operon, and biomechanics. So there's a lot of different areas in science and science education that have concept inventories. And where microbiology comes into this is in 2012, ASM developed the curricular guidelines for microbiology and for microbiology for health sciences. And so it was determined that we needed to develop a concept inventory for microbiology and for microbiology for health sciences. And so the research that Dr. Seitz and I worked on was this concept inventory. So let me tell you a little bit about that. I want to say first that I think there's a misconception among educators that when you develop a test or a test that's used by multiple professors, that you can just kind of come up with questions and then deploy it across, all members of a faculty or across colleges. For example, Valencia College has multiple campuses. So there's an idea that you can just make up a test and give it to everyone and it will be valid and reliable. And I want to say with, all respect and grace, this is to develop a true concept inventory is a very iterative process, and it takes a lot of time. I think this whole process took 3 to 5 years, if I remember correctly. Yes, Heather's verifying that. So what we did to develop the microbiology for health sciences concept inventory, first we surveyed faculty experts and found which concepts were most important to microbiology educators. And from that, we developed a series of true-false questions to identify student thinking and what their preconceptions or misconceptions were about these topics. And these were true-false questions that also asked students for their feedback. And so we then, after we got all of those results, we did a massive qualitative analysis of student responses. Again, this was an iterative process, and developed an open-ended survey to kind of, again, get more depth on student thinking. From there, we developed a forced answer survey, so a multiple choice test again, all of that. So we had a correct answer and then distractors, and the distractors for the multiple choice test all were based on student misconceptions. We used 3 coding teams to do all of the qualitative assessment. And that was, again, a long iterative process. Then we did validation. We did validation of the assessment itself, and then interviewed students to get, again, more student feedback, more student misconceptions, again, to sort of refine the assessment. And then we delivered the initial instrument before publication to about 620 students. And from there, we did our validation, our validity and reliability assessment. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather, and I'm going to mute, and she can talk all about all those fun statistics.
Awesome. So next slide, Andrea. Awesome. So when we think about the kinds of measurements that we do to make sure that an instrument is valid and reliable, I just wanted to kind of break those down a little bit. They can be really obviously important in creating a validated assessment like a concept inventory, but I found that work has actually translated into the classroom as well. And I think about these kinds of measurements when I'm creating any kind of assessment for my students. So we just wanted to unpack those a little bit for you guys and give you some information about the kinds of quantitative tests that we did to validate our concept inventory, and we continue to ensure that it's valid and reliable. So first up, this word validity, assessment validity. What this really means is that the test is testing what we think it's testing for, right? So if we are thinking about wanting to measure a particular content or a particular concept, or in the case of a concept inventory, a misconception, we have ways of measuring whether it's actually doing that work. There are a lot of types of validity. So you can see here some examples. So face validity, this is oftentimes how I approach a quiz or an exam that I've written for my students. I look at the responses. I'm like, yeah, that looks good. It seems like my good students did well, and the students that I knew that didn't understand a concept maybe missed those concepts. That makes sense to me. And that's sort of the weakest form of evidence, right? It's very anecdotal. It's very what you perceive to be the actual data about your assessment. And it's oftentimes what we do as instructors because of the nature of the time it takes to write these assessments between that and delivery. And we don't always spend a lot of time reflecting back on that data. Content validity, we really look at, do experts believe that the questions are accurate and reliable and true, right? So do they really think that the content of the question is valid? We don't really assess that quantitatively. That's really where we have our panel of experts. And so like Andrea just mentioned, we had a faculty panel that helped us initially think about what concepts were important. We then, at the end of drafting the concept inventory, we then also reviewed the content with faculty experts for that content validity. And then the criterion validity, this is where we can use math and quantitative measurements to look at validity coefficients. And typically we see that about 0.8 on our validity coefficient shows high validity. Let me do the next slide. The other part of that is reliability. So this is really saying, if you give this test to a student more than once, or if you give this test to my students and I give that to your students, is the test reliable between all those different kinds of scenarios? So we look at ways within a test to think about test retest. So giving the same set of students the same test, or while there may be some issues with that, thinking about, well, they know the answers maybe, right? We can also use parallel semesters. So different sets of students that have been treated by the same instructor and the same instructional method. Sometimes we can use that as a way of looking at test and retest and correlating scores over time. We also want to make sure that the reliability is true in different contexts. So when we developed the concept inventory, we made sure that the concept inventory was given in places all over the country. So we had a geographic distribution that helped us think about reliability. We also had institutional type balance to make sure that the assessment performed just as well in a community college classroom as it did in a four-year classroom. And then there's some quantitative tests that you can do to help think about this reliability. The Chromebox Alpha is one of the most common, and it calculates the correlation among all the different assessment variables. And again, as closer you get to one is the higher reliability. And then the Cuda-Richardson, which is what we ended up using, looks at whether it was right or whether it was wrong, right? So there's not a lot of nuance. It's just sort of a 0, 1. Yes, the answer was correct. No, the answer was not correct. And so that was appropriate for our assessment as it's a multiple choice. So they either got the answer right or they did not get the answer right. Anything on validity or reliability, Andrea, that you wanted to add for that?
No, just a lot of statistics. Lots and lots of statistics. So yes, that's something that comes with education research is lots of statistics. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, so the next slide will help kind of show how these things can be related. So again, we use the analogy of a bullseye, right? The bullseye is the sort of what we want to get to is we want to get to that bullseye. And so if we have validity, which is here on our x-axis, you can see that low validity means that we're not really getting the bullseye, is not really the center of where we're ending up, right? And then on the right-hand side, so higher construct validity really shows that we're around the bullseye. Now, it may be that it's not reliably around the bullseye, but that the answer choices all sort of are aligned with that center as the reliable content that we want to be testing for. And then reliability, we think about how consistent are we? So low reliability, on the y-axis, right? That really shows us that we have a lot of scatter in our data points, showing that perhaps the assessment's not very reliable. The high reliability, we see that things cluster together. So we, of course, are aiming for high reliability and high validity. We want to make sure that we're testing what we think we're testing for. We want to get that bullseye, and we want to get it consistently and reliably, no matter what kinds of students we're actually assessing. And so we want them clustered and we want them right at that bullseye. So that kind of helps you think about the kinds of tests and what they are telling us about the students that have taken it in the instrument itself. Yeah. All right, so some other things we look at. So not just is the test reliable and is it valid, but are students actually gaining learning gains between a pre-test and a post-test? And so that's obviously something that as instructors, we're very passionate about. We want the impact on our classroom to be something that we can look at and in some cases measure. And for the concept inventory, it was really important for us to think about these learning gains. The equation to calculate a normalized learning gain is right here on this slide, but basically it looks like the change in the class average score divided by the maximum possible gain. So a simple learning gain may just be post-test minus pre-test, right? And you kind of see the difference there. But if somebody already did very well on the pre-test, right, you want to take into account. So that divided by the maximum possible gain is a really important measure to really show us that these are normalized, that even people that came in with high levels of knowledge learned something, and the people that maybe scored very low on the pretest, that those gains are measured appropriately as well. When we think about the typical ranges for the normalized learning gains, we can see a couple of categories here. So a high normalized learning gain would be a 0.7, so 70% better is kind of a way to kind of think about that statistic. And then you have the medium range, and then a low range is less than 0.3%. So it's important to note that our concept inventory is a low normalized learning gain assessment. And that's because we are really addressing common misconceptions, right? When we developed this concept inventory, we didn't pick the items and the concepts that students knew really well. We actually picked the concepts from the ASAM curriculum guidelines and from the test pool that we started with. We picked the ones that students actually had the hardest time with. And we know that misconceptions can be very tricky and long-term in students' understanding. So we would expect that our assessment, we make progress, but it's a low learning gain environment for that assessment. Okay. And then item difficulty. This is a really easy statistic that you can use in your own classroom, but that's something that we pay attention to a lot when we think about the kinds of questions that we have on our assessment and which questions might need some revision or editing. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But item difficulty is simply the percentage of students who answered the question correctly. And so we can look at that at an item level, and we can take the average over all of the items to get an entire assessment measure of item difficulty. So the higher the difficulty, the not as difficult, right? So it's kind of a counterintuitive statistic in that the higher the item difficulty, the easier the item was. And that's because it is calculated as the percentage of students who answered it correctly. So 0.4 and above is considered a very good item, meaning that it's not very difficult and students can answer that question clearly. And then you can see down in the lower range, a very difficult question is going to be below 0.19 on this scale here. Yeah. Okay. And then discrimination. I oftentimes will look at discrimination. A lot of the learning management systems will calculate discrimination for if you deliver a quiz or an assessment online. And it's very important in developing a concept inventory and something we paid a lot of attention to. Discrimination means how good was this question at differentiating among students based on how well they know the material being tested, right? So are the students that are well prepared and come in with knowledge, are they doing better on that item than students overall who are not doing well on the entire assessment, right? So if you have a student, typically we look at maybe the top 25% of students that did the highest score on the entire assessment. Those are the sort of what we would consider the most prepared students for that assessment. That top 25, we look at each item and said, is it more likely that that student that did well on the entire test got this one question correct than the students maybe at the bottom end of the spectrum who were not as prepared for that assessment? And so there's a lot of measurements for discrimination. Pearson's product moment correlation is one way that we look at discrimination in an item. And you can see here, good discrimination is about 0.3. So that's just a primer to sort of some of the statistics that we did for the MHSCI. We did it originally when we developed the instrument, and we continue to look at those metrics even, I think, yeah, Andre, I think it's 4 years later, 4 years later. So looking at our specific assessment. So this is data from the Microbiology for Health Sciences concept inventory. So we have a normalized learning gain of 0.2. I mentioned that already, that it's in the low gain category. And that makes sense because we really are talking about student misconceptions and difficult ones at that. When we looked at item reliability, we still do and have a high reliability for our instrument. So our reliability score is 0.34. So that's above the expected value of 0.2. And then overall, if you average all of our items, we have a difficulty of 0.6, so about 60% of the students getting those right. And our discrimination is 0.4, which is again above the accepted value of 0.3. So from all the metrics that we can look at, our MHSCI is both reliable and valid, and that has been measured by looking at that particular collection of questions. So there's 23 multiple choice questions that we did the statistics on. If we change those questions, right, we need to restart and do these kinds of statistics again. And so we monitor them over time. That's helping us build more confidence in our whole test reliability. But as we'll talk about at the end, we're thinking about modifying and editing some of the items, in which case we will do this entire process again, which is not a small undertaking. All right. And I think I'm going to turn that back over to Andrea to talk a little bit about our study specifically.
Well, just before we move forward, I think it's important to understand that when you're developing an assessment that you're going to use maybe college-wide or across multiple sections, it's more than just coming up with a really good test bank. I think we all, as instructors, have the challenge of developing a test bank that really assesses what our students are learning, but to make sure that it's reliable and valid, you got to churn through all of these statistics and be aware of them. And it's always a good idea to have a good statistician on your team when you're doing stuff like this, because even though Heather and I have both taken, I don't know, tons of statistics classes, it's still a challenge to be able to calculate all of this. So So this is just a slide that shows us where the MHSCI is being used. demographically, there we have 54 instructors and 54 colleges, 74 instructors who are currently using this. And I'm sure there's a little bit of variability from this semester to semester. You can see the areas of the country where it's being used the most. Not surprisingly, in the Midwest, where Heather is, they're using it quite extensively. I'm doing my best down here in the Southeast, but we have 138 colleges using it, or 138 tests being given internationally. And there's a pretty even distribution between four-year public, four-year private, and two-year community college. Two-year community colleges are using it a little bit more than the public and private four-year colleges and universities. But the great thing about all of this use of the MHSCI is it helps sort of add to our database of how the students, how students are responding to the MHSCI, and kind of gives us more data about our validity and reliability. And just sort of anecdotally, every instructor that uses the MHSCI will get a report at the end of the semester that'll show their pre-test and post-test scores. When students take the MHSCI, they get a code for their pre-test that they give to their instructor. They get another code for their post-test that they will also share with their instructor. For example, I have a really low stakes assessment or assignment where I say, submit your pre-test and your post-test code. Then I can then I can track that data. Then Heather will send out a report at the end of the semester. And again, every instructor uses this a little bit differently. I endeavor, every semester is different, but I endeavor to send my students a report on how they did, pre versus post, and whether they improved. Other instructors use it for other, institutional assessments. Here at Valencia College, we used it college-wide as part of our college-wide assessment. So we use the MHSCI to sort of look at areas where our students are struggling. And the great thing about the MHSCI also is that it is aligned with ASM curriculum guidelines. So the learning outcomes on the assessment are aligned with those ASM guidelines, and that can kind of give institutions a picture of, are we really teaching what we should be teaching? Are our students learning? Do we have those learning gains? So it's a really valuable tool, both to individual instructors so that they can take a moment to think, okay, are my students learning? Am I meeting those learning outcomes during the course, before the beginning and the end of the course? And also you can use it as a department, a microbiology department, or college-wide, or multiple colleges. So then that was great. And then COVID hit, and we all had to shift. I'm sure all of us that are here, we are still reeling from that shift. Everything had to be moved online. We had to continue online learning. And so our other research paper that's come out from the MHSCI is the one that Rachel has sent to everyone. And it's just the impact of COVID on MHSCI outcomes. And what our research question was is we wanted to determine, did COVID-19 have an impact on student learning gains? And with every sort of statistical analysis, you have a null hypothesis that there's no difference. So what we did is we surveyed our MHSCI users and just sort of asked how their curriculum shifted. How many, instructors had courses that were already fully online before the pandemic? How many were fully online after the pandemic? And then we took our data. Again, we had this just vast data pool from the MHSCI. We looked at the pre-COVID pandemic years, the fall and spring semesters for 2018 and 2019. And then we looked specifically at the spring 2020 semester. And interestingly, and really kind of surprising to both of us, we didn't see any statistically significant change in learning gains. In fact, students seemed to have done better on the MHSCI post-test. So that was really, really interesting. And I also feel that, like the data emerging on COVID-19, the educational data that's emerging on the impact of COVID-19 on student success is in flux, in process. So we're going to talk, I'm going to send it to Heather. We're going to talk about the data that we got from the study and then kind of what our next steps are. So take it away, Heather.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want to just show you a little bit of the data from the paper and kind of talk a little bit about our main findings. And so this is figure 1 from our paper, and it really looked at the shift in modality of teaching. Figure 1 is lecture, and I'll show you figure 2 here in a second. But thinking about lecture, we knew that before COVID, pre-COVID, and Andrea mentioned that that's the academic years in 2018 and 2019, 4 semesters worth of data. There was about a little over 10% of our students that were taking the MHSCI were in an online microbiology lecture course. And you can see that the pretest, as we know, that's spring 2020 semester, the real COVID pandemic hit the United States very hard in March. And so we had pretest data from that semester that showed the start of a semester that might be more typical. And the pretest data here shows that, again, we had about 10% of the students started that semester of spring 2020 in a or in an online classroom. But by the end of that semester, by the time they took the post-test, you can see this huge shift in the online lecture. And we wanted to know, is that something that happened across all different institution types? And so for many of our data points, we actually present the data overall, but also show it by institution type. And we broke our institution types into 2-year institutions and then 4-year private and 4-year public. You can see some interesting trends here. So while 2-year and 4-year private institutions predominantly were the ones that switched to online, we saw less of a shift in our 4-year public institutions to that online modality. And then figure 2 really helps us look at the lab. Let me switch that slide, Andrea. Thank you. So looking at lab. So again, before pre-COVID, there was very little online microbiology laboratory experiences. We had less than 5% of our population had an online lab experience. And you can see during that COVID semester of spring 2020, while everybody started in a face-to-face lab, by the end of the semester, we had a huge increase to almost 30% of students overall were in an online microbiology lab experience. When we surveyed those students, we asked, and instructors, we asked about whether or not they were having an online lab or simply no lab present versus an on-campus lab. And you can see again, pre-test, we saw high rates of on-campus lab, as we would expect from our overall data, with 4-year public institutions having less on-campus lab. And if you notice the pretest data, it's actually they're more likely to have no lab at all associated with their microbiology course, the instructors that use the MHSCI. So about 25% of our 4-year public institutions, the students did not report having a laboratory component to their course. So they start off a little bit lower in that on-campus lab category. And then we can see that the 4-year private shifted predominantly to an online lab format, whereas the 2-year was equally likely to have either an online lab or no lab by the end of the semester. We saw 4-year public shift to 49% of those students responded that they didn't have labs. So we saw an increase in the amount of students at the 4-year public that didn't have lab at all over the course of the semester. All right, so for figure 3, we wanted then to say, okay, this is what has happened in the classroom. We wanted then to look and see what were the scores, the learning gains that we see on this instrument. And so we looked at a comparison of the pre and post MHSCI scores. So we can see that the number of items on the test are 23 items. And so we can see that overall, there was a significant, actually, a significant difference between the pretest scores pre-COVID and post-COVID, or during that COVID semester. So what that meant for us was, and it was a very surprising finding, was that COVID semester of spring 2020, that one semester, the average pre-test score was significantly lower than the previous 4 semesters, meaning that students starting that semester were doing less well on the MHSCI. What's, I think even more surprising, and Andre already alluded to this, was that we saw no significant difference in the post-test scores pre-COVID to that COVID semester. So the exciting thing is that even though those students during that COVID semester started out lower with their pre-test score, they achieved the same level of post-test score at the end. So that we saw was a surprising finding for us, right? That they did better overall. And then we looked at institution type for that as well. So the 2-year institutions and the 4-year public institutions, while not significant, they both trended towards an increase in pre to post-test scores. But we did see that the 4-year private institutions had a significant decrease in their post-test score pre-COVID to that post-COVID semester. Yeah. And then, like we mentioned before, item difficulty is something we keep track of and look at. And you can see that for each of the 23 items on our concept inventory, we have a wide variety of item difficulties. So you can see question number 2 on our MHSCI inventory is about vaccination and the positive impact of vaccination. I'm actually fascinated to go back and look at that data in the previous, since spring 2020, what does that data look like? But that tends to be one of our highest item difficulties, meaning that that's a question that our microbiology students get right almost all the time. 90% of our students are getting that question correct. So it certainly is our item that has the highest item difficulty index, meaning it's the easiest question for our students to answer. And that's a good thing. And then you can see question 17 down there, which is the little tiny bars, right? And so that question involves viral replication, which is a very difficult concept for students. And the misconceptions around viral replication are even more difficult. And so that's a question that has a low item difficulty index, meaning it's a very hard question and very few students actually get that question correct. Now, when we compared each of these item difficulty scores pre-COVID to post-COVID, we did not see any significant differences. So even broken down by question, we didn't see any huge trends in our 4 semesters prior to COVID with that COVID semester, which was an interesting finding for us. Yeah. All right, so that's the data that we had. One of the things that has come out since then, so we've been obviously many faculty in the sciences and across higher education are really thinking a lot more about what does student success look like in an online classroom, and what does it look like when we transition our lectures and our laboratories into virtual spaces. And so there's been a lot of studies obviously pre-COVID about online learning, but even more now are being published post-COVID about how we can do better, how we can take the lessons learned during that quick, abrupt transition in spring of 2020 and adapt them going forward. 2 particular papers I wanted to highlight that build off of the work that we've done, look at anatomy classrooms, and specifically anatomy and physiology classrooms, and how they have transitioned and what parts of the anatomy course have transitioned in well. And they found very similar results to ours in that they saw no decrease in learning gains or in course outcomes in those students. And we also saw a paper that looked at overall biology students across many different programs, looking at the interesting thing about that particular study was they looked at an online degree program. So a program that had been designed to be online and had been online for many years. And then they compared that with the on-campus program that then switched to an online format because of the pandemic. And they saw similar findings to ours in that there was no loss in learning gains or student outcomes during that transition. And while that was a bit surprising because everybody I think involved felt that our lives had been turned upside down and changed in immeasurable ways. And I feel like we still are dealing with a lot of that transition and change and difficulty. It appears as though our students, at least in the academic sense, in these particular types of courses, the measures that we can look at for learning gains appear to be, the students are doing fine in that regard. And I think there definitely is an area here for future research. And so Andre, did you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to add to that is we've been in discussions at ASMQ about online labs. And I think the general consensus of most microbiology educators is there's no way we're doing online labs because you miss so much of that aseptic technique practice and all of that. But what we're seeing from results of our study and these other studies is that students are doing as well in online labs. And I think that was something really surprising for all of us in microbiology education, because I've heard people say, you can pry my face-to-face lab for my cold dead hands, and there's no way we're doing online labs. And we're learning. And I think too, again, this is just as the COVID research is sort of emerging, the COVID education research is emerging, and it's going to take kind of a lot of time to like really look at all of the studies, and we need to look at other areas of science and science education, K-12 education included, to just really have a good picture of what the impact of COVID has been on our students. So this is just a small, very, very small slice of the pie. Okay, I think we're going to open it up to questions. So
yeah. And there's a number of questions in the question and answer that we can definitely address. I can answer that first one, Andrea. So
yeah, so let's get to it, and go ahead and stop sharing. Great. Okay, so I'll read it out. Okay, here we go. Question is, you've stated that the concept inventory is addressing student misconceptions and therefore rather difficult for them to score well on. We saw that in the data. Do you have any evidence that students taking a difficult exam about material new to them at the start of a class discourages them from continuing on with the class, or are they discouraged from the start?
Yeah, so I can start off on that answer. So one of the things we encourage, we have sort of a list of best practices when delivering the MHSCI. And one of the best practices is that we do not use the pretest score in any kind of a classroom assessment manner, meaning that they get credit for taking it if that's how you can incentivize them to do it. But their score does not impact their course grade or their course outcomes. We also don't spend a lot of time talking about their scores initially. And so they may not actually be aware of the score that they got as a pretest, so that we can avoid any kind of negative association with that. I think students come into class, oftentimes they feel like they might know something about the microbiology concepts that we're going to talk about. And in some cases, taking the MHSCI makes them, oh, there's still a lot that I need to learn, or I wasn't very confident about that. And that can actually be a really powerful conversation tool. I don't know, Andre, do you want to add anything else to that answer?
Yes, I've had students email me and they're like, oh, I bombed that and I'm so discouraged. And I try to encourage them. This is a starting off point. We're just trying to find out what you already know, and have this be a launching pad for what we're going to learn this semester. So, and I also try to tell them this is more an assessment of me as the instructor than it is the student and their knowledge. It is more an assessment of, am I meeting all the learning outcomes for this course? And I that sometimes helps them as well.
Yeah. Awesome.
Here's the next question. So you talked a little bit about concept inventories in general. Is the MHSCI questions mixed with other questions, or are the 23 set questions that you established in the 2017 paper, are they given on their own?
Go ahead.
These are all just related to microbiology. They are based on all of the questions for the microbiology for health sciences concept inventory are based on ASM curriculum guidelines and those learning outcomes that resulted from that. But again, there are other concept inventories that are related to other disciplines. I know that there's a microbiology majors, like just a microbiology concept inventory. And I think there are a couple of crossover questions between that. I think the one's related to immunology, but that's about it.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, you take the 23 questions from your inventory and give them as one single assessment, and you never parse out those questions and make your own assessment. Is that correct?
Right. So doing so would you would have to revalidate and do the statistical analysis to make sure that that assessment as a whole is valid and reliable. It's not that instructors couldn't do that on their own. They would just lose statistical power of our instrument. So the study that we presented and the work that we did to validate the instrument was just those 23 questions given. And that's how I use it in my classroom, is just those 23 questions.
Let's see. One question asked, can you post the citations for the articles you mentioned about the A&P and online biology courses?
Yeah, and I believe I put those in the chat.
Posted on it?
So, yep.
So we know that there has been, in some instances, more instances of cheating or academic dishonesty because of online courses. Do you think that your data take into account that students might be cheating when they're on online learning?
Yeah. So go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I think that is an issue that every instructor across all disciplines and institutions is dealing with right now. I'm not sure what controls are in place, Heather, for the MHSC. I don't think we have a lockdown browser or anything with that.
So again, sort of our best practices list for how to implement the MHSCI include not making it part of your course assessment. And so oftentimes students are motivated by the need to get a certain grade or to achieve a certain score, and are persuaded that maybe this is something worth that risk of the punishment of cheating. And so by taking that off the table, we try very hard to not incentivize the score that they get, which then de-incentivizes any cheating behaviors. It's common practice in using concept inventories to deliver these without having any kind of lockdown browser or anti-cheating software or anything in place. And for the most part, we look very carefully at item difficulty overall, and we would notice significant trends if everybody started getting the answers correctly, right? We keep an eye on that. We do only deliver the questions to instructors that have registered, but we don't verify that those instructors, we don't do any verification process on the instructors themselves.
You're fairly certain that your questions and answers aren't on Chegg or randomly.
Right. Yeah. So occasionally we do Google the questions and make sure that they're not out there. We haven't seen them yet. So yeah, that's a great question, Rachel.
That's good.
But
So,
it's always a challenge.
Very unlike my course tests.
Yes, mine too.
End up on Chegg very quickly.
no. Thing that I think everybody's dealing with.
Yes, I think that is a very common problem. I just revamped all of my course exams because of that. So I think that is a commonality with online learning.
So this question was posed, and the person that asked it, feel free to clarify in the Q&A if I don't get the question right in my interpretation. So the question reads, this is very interesting work. I want to know how you design the same questions for pre and post test for the same population. Also, didn't they get all the questions correct post COVID?
So the assessment itself is designed to be given as a pretest and a post-test, and we do use the same questions on the post-test as we do the pretest. And part of our statistical, I can't say that word today, statistical analysis looked at that reliability of test retest. And so we wanted to address that from semester to semester to make sure that that was happening. We again do not emphasize the correct answers. We ask instructors not to go over the questions one by one and talk about the correct answers in our best practices list. So again, we don't see huge problems with giving it as a post-test and having it be a reliable measure. I think that answers that question.
I think too, I don't think students even remember what the pre-test questions were, because I give it like the first 2 weeks of the semester. So by the end of a 16-week semester, there's been so much content between pre and post that there's no way that some students might remember, oh, I remember this question from before. But I think it's really rare that a student would have like a photographic memory of all the questions.
Yeah.
Good points. And this question is from an international attendee. outside the United States. Is there a process for using this at a university outside the United States? And how could you get involved?
Yeah, so we are happy to deliver it to anybody that would like to use it. If you need assistance in translating it into different languages, we're happy to work with you on that. We have, I believe, a version in French and a version in Spanish currently, but we are always looking for collaborators both here in the United States as well as abroad. So welcome aboard. Just email us and let us know that you're interested, and we can help get you in the right, give you the materials you need.
We will get to a few more questions in a moment, but we're going to take a quick time and ask everybody to give us your feedback on this webinar. So this webinar is being presented courtesy of ASM, free of charge to everybody. And so in order to continue programming like this, we do need everybody's feedback. So please take a couple of seconds to give us a quick to-answer multiple choice. And this is anonymous, and nobody's going to see the final results except administrators at ASM, who greatly appreciate your feedback. Into the chat while you're thinking about completing your feedback survey. Keep in mind that we're now calling for proposals for the 2022 American Society for Microbiology Conference for Undergraduate Educators. So this is an example of the kind of content that you might see at ASMQ. For instance, something very similar about the MHSCI was presented at ASMQ a couple years ago. And so if you find content like this very useful, then consider presenting a talk and coming to ASMQ. It will be an online conference, July 13th through 15th in 2022. And I'm the person that you can contact for more information. I'll put my email address in the chat in just a moment. Okay. So thank you so much for participating in our feedback. Okay, so let's continue with some more questions. What do you think about this? It's not really a question, but I believe that we need to follow up with that while students are scoring well on these lab concepts, how well do you think that they'll be able to actually work in a lab or a nursing setting after their job? Do you think that these not being able to physically manipulate organisms in the lab is going to be detrimental?
I think about that question all the time. I have personal experience working with nurses in my life, from NICU to hospice care. And I have I have seen in my day-to-day life what kind of things nurses do in a nursing setting as compared to what they do in my lab, my microbiology labs. And I think almost all microbiology educators would agree who teach pre-nursing students would say they're never going to do a gram stain. They're never going to do an acid fast stain or an endospore stain or a biochemical test or any of those sorts of tests, a dilution series as a nurse. And I think what is so vital about microbiology for health sciences is the idea of asepsis and the awareness of microbes and the diseases that they cause. Our health sciences students will go on to get all of that training on, catheter insertion and IV placement and G-tube and sterile suctioning and all the things that a nurse would do to be aseptic. I spent a lot of time in the UTI lab talking about how fun it is to put in a urinary catheter and why they contribute to urinary tract infections, but they will learn how to insert that catheter in their nursing programs. But what we teach them is the aseptic foundation and the understanding of the microbes that cause urinary tract infections and why implanting medical devices form biofilms. That's what we give them. And so the practice of making a good quadrant streak or doing a good gram stain isn't vital to their job as a healthcare professional. I have students in nursing, they're going into nursing, physician's assistant, nurse practitioner, and also dental hygiene. And so again, like the stuff that are kind of core concepts in the laboratory, the techniques that are core they're not going to actually be doing those. But what we give them is that perspective on the awareness of where microbes are on the human body and the environment, and how to promote aseptic practices. So, sorry, I think I kind of over answered the question. So how do we assess, I don't know, Heather, can you maybe follow up on that?
So yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's important to think about what kinds of tasks they learn in the microlab that translates into their workforce. For us, the MHSCI concept inventory does not actually talk a lot about lab concepts. So we don't actually have data about whether or not students have been scoring well on lab concepts or lab techniques. We really look at misconceptions in the subject or content area of microbiology. So just a little bit of a disclaimer is we're not trying to claim that their lab knowledge and the lab concepts was the same or increased over the study that we did. I think it's a fascinating study, and I think it's something that we need to look at, not just in microbiology labs, but in life sciences and overall, is what kinds of techniques and what can they do, right? How can we measure what students are able to do in ways that are impactful and important in their next steps? For the MHSCI, we did consult those next steps. We talked to faculty in nursing, faculty in dental hygiene, faculty in pre-pharmacy programs, to help make sure that the concepts were going to be valuable in those disciplines. But we did not, again, address those lab techniques. And I think it's a really important study that I think I would love to see and help with. Yeah,
I agree.
So we don't have any more questions coming in, but before we leave, I'd like to hear a little bit about, you talk a little bit about your background and what brought you to do discipline-based education research, because your backgrounds are very different. And a lot of our attendees were likely trained to do laboratory or modeling or field-based studies, and not to do this kind of education research. So each of you talk for a little bit about how you got to this expertise.
Yeah, I can go ahead and start. So I am from Nebraska, and I'm a first-generation college student. So going into my higher education journey, I wanted to do lab stuff. And so I left the university and headed straight to a PhD program where I did research on microbiology and immunology, mostly on immunology concepts. And leaving that program, I thought that I wanted to go in and do a postdoc in research. And so I had a postdoc lined up in Kansas City, where I currently live, from my postdoc opportunity in North Carolina, and had a semester off. I had just had a baby, and I took a semester off between my postdoc and starting my second postdoc in research, and got an opportunity to teach at the community college. And so I taught as an adjunct that summer semester. I taught microbiology, and my life changed, right? I was like, this is where it's at. This is super exciting. Getting to engage with students is really my passion, but I still missed research. And so a couple years after I began my community college position, I was involved in ASM's Biology Scholars program, where I learned the techniques and the research design process on how to conduct educational research. And that allowed me to take what I loved and was passionate about for so many years in research and apply it to the new environment that I found myself in an educational setting. And so through Biology Scholars, I reconnected with an old friend, Samantha Elliott, who was at the time, the editor at Jimby. And through that work and that network that I've had through ASM, I've been able to grow my educational research opportunities. I headed up the task force for this concept inventory through them. I currently now have 3 different NSF projects that I am the PI on, and have continued to stay involved in educational research, and the people, right, is why I do that. So that's kind of my journey. I've been at the community college now for 14 years, so doing that work. Yeah.
Well, I started through a series of events. I have a master's degree in microbiology, and my husband was going to school here in Orlando, Florida at Full Sail University. And I had worked in a little bit in research at a biotech firm. I'd worked a little bit for Minute Maid actually as a QA specialist, and I really wasn't my thing. So I started teaching part-time. We had young children, including a child with some severe disabilities. And so I stayed working part-time for quite a while, and I started going to ASMQ, American Society for Microbiology's conference for undergraduate educators. And because I was frustrated with the things that I was seeing, things would work one semester for one section and not the next semester. And I didn't know how to collect that data. I had done research, I had published as a scientist, but I didn't know how to collect that education research. That's where I met Heather and Samantha Elliott and Rachel. And it was, I am a longtime attendee of ASMQ, so I will just plug that. And what ASMQ did for me was help me start to learn how to collect data and improve my curriculum. And I just felt like that wasn't enough. So in 2014, I started a PhD program in science education at the University of Central Florida, where I learned, well, it was a lot. It was a PhD program in science education. And so I took a lot of statistics classes. I learned how to curriculum development and design and assessment. And it was at the end of my PhD program that at an ASMQ, Heather came to me and said, hey, do you want to be involved in this project? And I have a real problem with saying yes to too many things, but it always works out. And so I was able to work on this, was able to apply the things that I'd learned in my PhD program. And after that, I was hired as a full-time faculty member at Valencia College. And so I continue to work on various education research projects with Heather, with another colleague, Jeff Olimpo. I'm on a PhD committee for a science educator. And it's, but I think for me, it all comes back to that ASMQ meeting where my eyes started opening on how I could be a better teacher by doing research with my students and designing my curriculum more effectively. So it's been a great journey. I've been in higher education now for 20 years.
So diverse, both of you are so very different backgrounds, but yeah, so it was a pleasure hearing from both of you today. And so at this point, our webinar is ended. And so this concludes our webinar series for fall 2021. And be on the lookout for a new series in the winter of 2022. I'll put together a nice slate of speakers, probably February through May, and then we'll take a break and we'll have ASMQ in July. So all those will be available to you. So pay attention to your inboxes and we'll email you notification when those are available. And a recording of this will be posted to Jimby's YouTube playlist. So you'll get a reminder email directing you of how to get there. So thank you so much for attending today. Thank you to our speakers. I loved having you.